So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this February seminar of the Standing Group on the European Union of the CPR. And we have the pleasure today to have Jan Krotký. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name so well. So Jan is currently postdoctoral researcher for the IMPACO project on interparliamentary cooperation in the EU, an assistant professor in political science at the University of Wrocław. And he will present a paper, as you will see, entitled, this conference has no legitimacy, Delegitimization of the conference on the future of Europe in the European Parliament. And we'll have, after his presentation, we'll have a discussion first with the official discussant, Alvaro Oleart, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for European Studies at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, so that I don't have any issue with my alma mater. I pronounce it in French, so the University of Brussels. So Jan, you will have for about 40 minutes to present your research. Then Alvaro, you will have more or less 10 minutes to give your feedback to Jan, and then we'll open up the floor, so you will have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments. I will ask you to present yourself before asking a question and turning on your camera before doing so. But without further ado, Jan, I give you the floor for 40 minutes.
Thank you, Natalie, for introducing me. And thank you, Jonathan and Natalie, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss with you and to present my research. This conference has no legitimacy. And as Natalie mentioned, this research was done under IMPACO research led by Karolina Boronská-Hryniewiecka, and we studied potential of interparliamentary cooperation. And we also studied how European Parliament and national parliaments cooperated during the conference on the future of Europe. However, this presentation will solely focus only on European Parliament, on its political groups, and on Eurosceptic discourse and how Eurosceptic political groups delegitimized the conference on the future of Europe. I will start with brief introduction into the conference objectives and structure. The conference on the future of Europe may say that it was perceived as a response to persisting gap between EU citizens and EU institutions, and it's part of post-Lisbon participatory innovations, enhancing the role of ordinary citizens and linking them directly to the agenda-setting phases. I forgot to mention that the Conference on the Future of Europe was spent between April 2021 and May 2022. And it was intended to be a groundbreaking citizen-driven initiative. The conference also represents a novel approach to the EU governance by combining deliberative democracy, discussing with citizens on EU issues, alongside representative democracy, discussing citizens with MEPs and representatives of national parliaments and representatives of other institutions. Conference was composed of three main platforms. The first multilingual digital platform was a hub for citizens to share their ideas. And then there was European citizens panels, which were forums where citizens provided their recommendations to the conference. It covered nine topics like migration, EU democracy, EU in the world, health, digital transformation, climate change. And then there was conference plenary. composed of 433 members, and as I said, MEPs, representatives of national parliaments, but also ambassadors of European citizens panels. There were also representatives of Council, Commission, Committee of the Regions, and these members, these representatives discussed the recommendations from the citizens panels and the input from the multilingual platform. And they put forward proposals to the executive board. As you can see, executive board was composed of 9 representatives, 3 from European Parliament, 3 from Commission, and 3 from Council. And and conference was led by 3 presidents from the European Parliament, Council, and European Commission. One of the innovations brought by the conference is the institutionalization of citizen panels in the EU governance, as you can see from the quote put forward by von der Leyen in 2022. She argued that the citizens panels will become new institutions by which citizens will discuss the EU issues. And last year there were 3 citizens panels on food waste, virtual worlds, and learning mobilities. And this year there will be 1 more on energy efficiency. So you can see the citizens panels has become a new feature of EU governance. Conference final report consisted of 49 proposals with over than 300 measures, and the European Parliament, in consequence, called on EU member states to set up a convention to revise the treaties. What we know about the position of the European Parliament? As I said, the European Parliament played quite important role because its 3 members were part of executive board. It was part of a joint presidency, and the research so far mainly focused on the European Parliament as a unitary actor who's acting with single voice. And there is no research so far who would look at the positions of its political groups. There is research of Johansson and Ronio from 2022 who they examined positions of 3 biggest pro-European political groups: European People's Party, Social and Democrats, and Renew Europe. However, we still know a little about the positions of the other political groups. So therefore, I posed the first research question: whether and to what extent we can talk about homogeneous position or a unitary actor when we refer to the EP position and activity within the CoFoE. As we know, ECR, European Conservatives and Reformists, withdraw from the conference in its conclusion in April 2022. And as title of this presentation suggested, the conference was indeed delegitimized and contested from Eurosceptic positions. So the second research question which I posed is: how was the conference contested and delegitimized by Eurosceptic actors? As methods, I use qualitative content analysis together with thematic analysis, and to see internal power struggles within the political groups. I also calculated intra-group cohesion on roll call votes, on motions for resolutions from 2020 and 2022. There were 3 resolutions concerning the conference on the future of Europe. As the data, except of motions for resolutions, I also analyzed speeches in the European Parliament and documents published by the political groups. First of all, I analyzed whether a cordon sanitaire was established to exclude Eurosceptic political groups from the EP position drawing, because we know that European Parliament was the first institution which provided the positions towards the Conference on the Future of Europe. It was even before the new commission was appointed. They already started to work on conference. And this joint resolution from January 2020 was signed by all pro-European groups: European People's Party, Socialists and Democrats, Renew, Greens, and by the left. So therefore, I call these groups, I frame them as a CoFoE coalition, as conference coalition. ECR and ID, European Conservatives and Reformists, and Identity and Democracy. These two right-wing Eurosceptic political groups abstained or voted against, and instead they proposed their own motions for resolution. Therefore, I call these two groups as a part of conference opposition. From the EP debates, from the speeches of MEPs, they give us some hints about this cordon sanitaire. Ryszard Antoni Legutko from ECR, from Polish Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, he argued that 5 groups prepared this position, the European Parliament position, in secret and excluded 2 groups. By 2 groups, he meant ECR and ID. And he framed this process, this cordon sanitaire, as tyranny of the majority. Likewise, Laura Huhtasaari from ID labeled the joint resolution preparation as totalitarian practice. And she said that ID group has been ignored in the European Parliament position preparation. In contrast, Sven Simon from European People's Party came with another interpretation of the cordon sanitaire, and he said that it was their choice to withdraw. Conference coalition or the pro-European political groups didn't exclude anyone, but it was choice of ID and ECR. The available data don't provide information whether the cordon sanitaire or self-exclusion has been established. Anyway, MEPs from ECR and ID incorporated this notion of exclusion into their narrative, how pro-European political groups led the conference, and how integrationist groups formed elite cartel to help each other hold on to power. To understand the reasons behind this self-exclusion of cordon sanitaire and to this division between conference coalition and conference opposition, I looked I analyzed the motions for resolutions of these three groups or 2 groups. And I looked what was their position towards conference as a participatory tool. I looked who should be leader of the conference, who should have leadership, and what should be institutional preferences debated, discussed, deliberated within the conference. And conference coalition composed of pro-European groups plus the left. They were very favorable of participatory democracy as a tool of deeper integration. They promoted European Parliament as a leading institution of this conference, and they suggested that lead candidate system and transnationalists should be considered as topics deliberated within the conference. On the other hand, ECR also said that participatory democracy is possible together with ID. However, ECR perceived conference as a platform to discuss alternatives to the traditional federalist orthodoxy. They argue that national parliaments should have the leading role during the conference, and both ID and ECR, they promoted more intergovernmental suggestions to the EU functioning, such as expansion of national veto rights, principles of subsidiarity and proportionality, the legislative initiative to national parliaments. Overall, the role of national parliaments was quite important for ECR and ID. They promoted national parliaments as an institution which should have more powers in the EU structure. Then I looked on overall evaluation of the conference, and not surprisingly, but coalition framed the conference as a success, ECR and ID as a failure. CoFoE conference coalition called for convening convention, and they supported enhancing the interparliamentary cooperation. ECR, on the other hand, rejected the conclusions, and ID invited citizens to complain to their national ombudsman and the European ombudsman. So, I think it's quite interesting that ID on conclusion welcomed improving the involvement of national and regional parliaments in the EU legislative process. So that's something again what can be some common topic for all political groups, improving interparliamentary cooperation or improving and enhancing the role of national parliaments. Then I looked to intergroup cohesion on roll call votes, to see intergroup struggle within the political groups. And I picked for purpose of this presentation, I chose a resolution from 2022. It's a resolution on the follow-up of the conference, and I chose 4 statements which were part of this resolution: satisfaction with the conference proposals, right of legislative initiative for the European Parliament, abolition of unanimity in the Council, and calls for the convening of convention. The findings reveal that the ID and ECR displayed relatively high intragroup cohesion against all the proposals. For the right of legislative initiative, for the EP, the ID faced a dispute over whether to vote no or abstain. More variation were observed within the CoFoE coalition camp. Only the Greens expressed satisfaction with all proposals, achieving over 90% cohesion in each roll call vote. The integrationist groups, the pro-European political groups, displayed unity in their satisfaction with the conference, with the right of legislative initiative for the EP, and with the proposal to convene a convention, with cohesion levels consistently above 0.8. However, concerning the proposal for the abolition of unanimity in the Council, cohesion dropped below 0.8 for Socialists and Democrats, below 0.7 for Renew, and below 0.5 for EPP. So the integrations groups were very divisive on this statement, which was part of resolution. EPP members not only abstained, but also voted against this idea. This divergence signals possible challenges in the future talks on EU reforms in the face of potential enlargement. And if the largest integrationist groups in the EP cannot find a common ground on this matter, breaking the deadlock in the European Council could be very difficult. However, the most interesting, from my point of view, is the position of the left. The left also constantly joined and signed all three CoFoE-related motions for resolution prepared between 2020 and 2022, together with integrationist groups. The calculation of the roll call vote revealed internal dissent within the group on this issue. The left demonstrated low cohesion across all four aspects, with 0.67 cohesion on satisfaction with the CoFoE and support for convention, and only 0.47 cohesion on abolishing unanimity and support for legislative initiative for the EP. To understand deeply this dissent within the left and why ECR and ID were from the beginning quite in opposition towards the Conference on the Future of Europe, I employ thematic analysis and analyzed the discourse around the Conference on the Future of Europe provided by the left, ECR, and ID. The first theme which I found silent was the theatrical performance. The farce, clown show, piece of theater, commedia dell'arte, or theatrical performance. These metaphors were quite common and employed by Eurosceptic MEPs to characterize and delegitimize the CoFoE. So that's the reason why I call this theme as theatrical performance. This theme is composed of several arguments or codes, as you wish. The first, manipulation, that statements labeling the CoFoE as manipulated or distorted. Top-down process means statement challenging the top-down nature of CoFoE, led by politicians or pro-European political groups. Then there was predetermined outcome as another code, label, or argument. This argument is means signaling that outcomes of the conference mirror the initial agenda of the organizers. Non-transparency, that's clear. The MEPs criticized the transparency of the conference. The same is for lack of public. They criticized that nobody were aware of this conference, like ordinary citizens weren't aware of this conference, and conference lacked of public and media attention. And tyranny of majority, example I have already said a few slides before, statements lamenting over the exclusion of critical voices in the CoFoE process. As you can see on the table, this delegitimization was provided by the ECR, ID, but also by the left. So all three political groups, not better on left-right positioning, they agreed, they participated on this delegitimization. The second silent topic, silent theme, was lack of representativeness. I chose as a quote to provide more insights into this theme. I chose a quote by Angel Jambaski from ECR. and he said in EP plenary, "Where is your representativeness? A bunch of NGOs, that was your representation. You should have invited Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Yankee Doodle. They would have been more representative, and they would have shown exactly what you have done with this ridiculous clown show." As evident from the quote, the theme of lack of representativeness is linked with metaphor of theatrical performance. However, Angel Zambaski questioned the representativity of the conference by suggesting that cartoon characters would represent EU society in the same way as the invited citizens or societal groups. Again, as shown in the table, the theme was composed of several arguments or codes. And the first is integrationist bias, that statements arguing that the conference was led, participated, and pushed by actors and citizens promoting deeper EU integration. The second code is selection bias, that statements challenging the selection of citizens and involved actors, such as society groups. Then institutional bias, that's very similar. It's about arguing that some institutions have been overrepresented or underrepresented. For example, national parliaments were underrepresented and MEPs from Western Europe were overrepresented, according to some statements of MEPs. And the last one, age bias, that was only expressed 3 times by ECR MEPs, and that's statements challenging the overrepresentation of the youth. Why they delegitimize conference by this statement is, from my perspective or from my interpretation, that younger generations are more pro-European. So that's the reason why ECR was criticizing this bias, and I have to say that it was in purpose. Organizers of the conference, they purposefully overrepresented young generation. For this team, the notion of integrationist bias is the most prominent and central within this team. Eurosceptic groups and MEPs expressed dissatisfaction, arguing that the conference presented only one vision of the EU, and voices critical of further centralization of the European Union had been systematically disadvantaged from the beginning. Basically, their criticism aimed to depoliticize debate over the CoFoE, led mainly by the integrationist views and participants. In other words, they wanted to have more politicized conference on the future of Europe. What's important on this table is that the left, MEPs from the left, have not participated on this team at all. There is no single statement from the left side who should question representativeness of the conference. Why so? I argue that the internal divisions, dissent, and criticism within the left were notably influenced by its generally ambivalent position towards the EU. On the one hand, the left criticized the EU political structures and neoliberal policies. On the other hand, it's in favor of stronger integration in many areas such as fiscal or environmental policy, in order to offer pan-European solutions to pressing problems, socioeconomic problems. And this position corresponds to what De Wild and trends called ultra-European performance. The left's criticism towards conference has thus focused on the notion of the EU as an actor incapable of reducing social inequalities. In contrast, right-wing Eurosceptic MEPs criticized the deeper integration of the EU, advocating for more powers to national authorities, national parliaments, which is typical Euro-critical performance, again, characterized and defined by Wilde and Trends from 2012. In other words, the left promotes pan-European solution, so they are indeed in favor to have pro-European voices and representatives in the conference. So that's why I think they weren't involved in this team and this discourse, and only ECR and ID promoted this delegitimization. As the last stage, I looked at the scientific and assessment of the CoFoE to see whether some criticism is not mirrored with this delegitimization provided by ECR, left, and ID. And indeed, scholars agree that the CoFoE, the conference, brought minimal media and public attention. There are also some scholars who say that the deliberative process lacked diverse representations. That's argument also provided by ECR and ID. Also, the selection of citizens was based on national, urban, rural divide, socioeconomic background, age, and gender. There was no consideration towards political orientation and attitudes towards the EU. Oleart, who is discussant of today's presentation, I am happy he's here. He argues that the Conference on the Future of Europe missed its agonistic potential as it reproduced the already hegemonic and power structures conceived as democracy without politics. This was done through disintermediation of the traditional mediators, such as civil society organizations, political parties, and trade unions, with emphasis on neutrality and leaving aside the political conflict, which can be framed as depolitization. And that's the topic which was also criticized by Eurosceptic political groups. I'm reaching the end, and before I will conclude, I would like to answer the research questions. So the answer to the first research question, the image of United European Parliament falls apart. ECR and ID were self-excluded, or cordon sanitaire was established. And analysis of intergroup cohesion revealed that also pro-European groups were divided on unanimity in the council, and especially the left was divided on the Conference on the Future of Europe. The European Parliament's diverged visions on the conference was influenced by attitudes towards the EU itself rather than the traditional left-right political spectrum. The answer to the second research question is that ID and ECR contested the Conference on the Future of Europe, perceiving it as a platform promoting federalism and ever-close union, which is typical Euro-critical stance that thematize the CoFoE as a theatrical performance with a lack of representativeness. On the other hand, the left contested the CoFoE from the ultra-Europeanism position, not joining the right-wing political groups on theme which I named as a lack of representativeness. Consequently, both sides, the left on the one hand and the ECR and ID on the other hand, were disappointed by the outcomes of the CoFoE, albeit for different reasons. Considering the left's position and its low intergroup cohesion, the fact that they joined the EP resolutions could be seen as success for the integrationist groups. This move could have potentially bolstered the vision of united European Parliament, with only right-wing Eurosceptic opposition. To conclude, the left, ECR, and even the ID have not questioned the participatory mechanism itself, rather they have delegitimized its depoliticized nature. Based on that, quite provocatively, I argue that cordon sanitaire in some instances might be counterproductive, as it helps Eurosceptic parties in defining themselves in contrast to mainstream parties. This approach also acts as filter for criticism, which, as demonstrated, is not always unfounded. The politicization could provide perspectives for improving new political tools, such as participatory dynamics, within the functioning of the EU. At a general level, not only policy contestation, as argued by Oleart, but also political contestation, for example, questioning the integrationist vision, promoting intergovernmental solutions, could foster empowered dissensus. It could possibly help to build European public sphere when we will discuss not only policy, but also polity of the EU. And 1640, so I managed to be on time, and that's all from my side for now. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Jan. It was very clear. So now I give the floor to Alvaro to discuss your presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Natalie, and thanks a lot, Jan, for this great paper and the presentation. Really enjoyed both the presentation and the paper. So yeah, I mean, there are many good things to say about the article. I think it will be a very nice contribution. It's well written. There's a clear point, interesting empirics, and good normative claims. So a lot of good stuff there. Also, I'm a big fan of including the quotes to kind of narrate the story that you're telling in the article, and you do that very nicely. So that's something I really like about the article. Then I also like obviously the normative argument about the empowering dissensus and so on, and I think it's a really interesting lens to look at it from. So all those good things said, I also have some more critical comments about the paper. The first one is about the use of Euroscepticism and Eurosceptic. I mean, I do have some questions about the Euroscepticism as an analytical category, but I know that's a broader question. But here, I really think that it poses some empirical problems, because it's sort of, you immediately situate together the left with ECR and ID. And I think that create some analytical tensions to, okay, first you put them separate because the left signed the first joint declaration, and then you separate them. But then when you look at the empirics, basically you see that the left is even barely contesting what the conference is saying, or in very minor ways. So yeah, is that Euroscepticism, or is it more like the contestation from the extreme right? That's a little bit different. And even then, I do have some questions, because I have no sympathy for either ECR or ID, but at the same time, you put some examples, for example, related to national parliaments, the championing of national parliaments, and so on. Is that Eurosceptic? And there's some instances in which you sort of suggest that a little bit, that as an example of the contestation of the conference from a Eurosceptic point of view, they are championing national parliaments as opposed to the European Parliament. I think that there are some questions about that. I don't necessarily think that the kind of argument in favor of national parliaments within the EU is necessarily Eurosceptic. I mean, maybe in some instances, but yeah. So yeah, I think that there's something that can be done to nuance the Euroscepticism as the overall framing of the contestation of the conference that that you are describing. This is also relating to the codes, because I do see how some of the codes, for example, the manipulation or predetermined outcome, can be fitting into kind of the Eurosceptic narrative about the EU as they are living in this bubble and so on and so forth. But for the others, is there something specifically Eurosceptic about those codes? I am not convinced about that. So, I mean, maybe they don't say it in public, but I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of MEPs from the Greens, from Renew, from the Social Democrats that probably would also agree about the lack of public attention, non-transparency, top-down process. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure those codes can be immediately linked to a Eurosceptic perspective. I mean, I could see how some of those codes can build a broader narrative about the EU that is Eurosceptic, but those specifically, I am not, I am not entirely convinced. And here we also pose again the issue with the left, because the left has quite different results from the ECR and ID. And I'm thinking also there were also actors like Helmut Scholz from the left, that was one of the observers to executive board, that was super involved and probably would reproduce much of the kind of pro-integrationist discourse as you mentioned it there. So yeah, I think that analytical category can have also some empirical challenges related to it. Then I also wanted to, I wanted to also mention this. The ECR and ID, what is really interesting is that, I mean, certainly there is a Euroscepticism there, but it also plays a lot into the hands of the council. So what you would see in the conference is that what the ECR and ID representatives are doing is very closely related to what the council is doing, and the opposition that the council is making, because ultimately the conference was a lot about an interinstitutional struggle, right? And ultimately, I feel that the ECR and ID positions, were most of the time playing in the hands of the council, at least, as I saw it. Okay, then maybe the last part. So you didn't talk about it too much in the presentation, but you make a broader normative claim about, okay, we need politicization. Politicization is good. We need contestation that will bring more legitimacy to the EU and so on, which I am fully with you. At the same time, I have several questions. First, is there any polity contestation in the conference? Or, because you also say, well, polity contestation is good, and, the EU is unfinished polity and so on. Let's bring it on. But is there really, even the codes that you describe, are there any that relate to a polity contestation type? Second, you end a little bit the argument, the paper, suggesting that in the end, like, you end up with consensus democracy. So I was a little bit confused by the last part of the conclusion, because you make a little bit this argument in favor of contestation and politicization, and at the end of the article, you bring consensus democracy as a way to go, and you ultimately say the article is not advocating accommodating Eurosceptic discourse. So it was that confused me a little bit, that it came a little bit at the end. And there's also this last part in which you sort of suggest that Euroscepticism can be or is closely linked to illiberal and undemocratic tendencies that undermine fundamental rights. And I have, again, it comes back to a little bit the initial comment about Euroscepticism as the initial frame. So this last part, I would either integrate this consensus democracy perspective a little bit in the theoretical part and so on, so that it doesn't come in too late, or delete it, basically. Yeah. Maybe I will stop here, but really enjoyed reading the article and the presentation, so thanks a lot for the invitation to discuss it.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. So Jan, you can already, if you want, come back to some of Alvaro's comments, and then for the audience, you can already prepare any questions. So just raise your hands or write your comment in the chat, and I will read it out loud, but preferably raise your hand, then I will give you the floor. So Jan.
Thanks, Alvaro, for comments. It's very helpful, and I will be totally honest. And when I started to write, I shared article with Alvaro, and when I started to write this article, and I wanted to avoid of these Euroscepticism categories and these definitions. Because it creates some problems, which you already mentioned, and also we can also label as Eurosceptic some pro-European political groups or MEPs, because they are very critical towards current EU polity and EU policies, right? So they can be also defined as Eurosceptic in some interpretation. So I started with polity and policy contestation as some, like, the first point, or the first point, and then anyway, because literature writes about Euroscepticism, and I still included this Euroscepticism in the article. So maybe I will return the question for you, whether it wouldn't be helpful if I would work only with contestation as a concept in the article, to work with policy and polity contestation, and to respond to the question, is there any political contestation? I think that the position of ECR and the left, and not the left much, but the position of ECR and ID, which I presented in the presentation, they are very much about polity contestation. They questioned the pro-integrationist visions, which I think it's about policy. It's about polity, how the EU should look like. Should be more in the shape of federalism, or more as an intergovernmental system. So from my point of view, this is really the arguments which I presented. I think majority of them could, from my perspective, comes under polity contestation. And thanks for the ending of my article, where I conclude with some suggestion how consensus democracy could be mixed with participatory democracy. Yeah, and I agree that it came too late, and maybe it's not necessary, and I should delete it. Whether ECRs and IDs position mirror the council, that's also a good point. Thanks for that. I think I can solve it by more contextualization of the position of the council towards the conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jan. So I don't see so far any hands. Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, unlike Alvaro, obviously, I haven't had a chance to read your paper, so I've just listened to your presentation. And my question, also sort of revolves around the end of the paper and the framing of the paper and the kind of takeaways from the paper. So, I mean, what I miss a little bit is trying to situate the conference on the future of Europe in perhaps the broader non-EU literature about mini publics, deliberative democracy, and so on. And it may be that I also have not read the secondary works that you cite, and it may be that they do that. But if I think of, you know, the mini publics or deliberative assemblies, which are considered to have been reasonably successful in that they've had a significant impact on policy debates and maybe even decisions. I mean, I think of things like the Irish Assembly that dealt with abortion. I think of you know, the British Columbia Citizens Assembly. I think in a way of you know, the process that Macron set up on climate change, where, I mean, on the one hand, they came up with a lot of proposals, but they weren't taken up. But still, you know, I would say they had a significant political impact also because of the, you know, the fact that Macron said he would take them very seriously, and then in the end, he didn't take them up. And I would have said that all of these cases were ones where the process was not highly politicized in a party political way. I mean, you know, citizens took positions, but they had more impact precisely because they were not simply representing established party political currents, which is basically, in a way, what the ECR and ID groups were largely asking for. And so I wonder whether you could relate, you know, what you're arguing about, you know, the benefits of a more agonistic and politicized approach to experience with these kinds of, you know, deliberative assemblies elsewhere.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ben?
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks for interesting paper. It's nice to be discussing the conference. I'm not sure how many people are still doing that, but still. I think, I mean, the main question for me is really when you talk about the attitudes of members of the European Parliament towards the conference, the question is, can you distinguish between whether they liked it intrinsically for what it was as a democratic device, or whether they approached it mostly instrumentally as a stepping stone towards their own agenda of getting a treaty change process started? And I think it's important whether it's this opportunistic motivation to push their own agenda, or indeed a kind of intrinsic commitment. And what's related here, so that kind of, to unpack the question a bit, I think what motivates them, whether it's intrinsic or instrumental, I think would also reflect on the extent to which they would show any changing positions over time. So whether they would move, if indeed the conference disappointed, then probably you would become more critical. And you seem to tap a bit of that sentiment among the left, but the other parties seem to be consistently positive and great, and let's move on. So I think that's interesting. But so I'm curious whether you have more variation over time, whether they move with the sentiment. I mean, I think the overall perception of the conference was that if anyone was optimistic at the beginning, people became more skeptical as it moved on, and certainly as we are moving away from it again. So, and then also to unpack that a bit more, I think there's also maybe more that you can exploit by even unpacking the party groups a bit more. To a large extent, of course, the positions of the party groups are driven by individual members of the European Parliament, mostly indeed the people in this case of the Constitutional Affairs Committee. So I'm curious whether you could reflect a bit more on the key people here. Of course, Manfred Weber was active in the conference. Well, the usual suspects in the Constitutional Affairs Committee. But I do think that the role of these kind of, say, spokespeople in the different party groups could, well, there's more that you could make of it. And also indeed the extent to which they actively participated, maybe even at a higher level in the conference. And then very quick final question is, would you say on the whole that the ECR was possibly even more critical than the idea? I mean, normally we position the idea as more extremist and the ECR is a bit more moderate. But from the evidence that you showed, I sometimes got the impression that the ECR was actually had a more developed critical position, a more coherent and more full-blown, but also in a way a much more harder anti-position than the idea, which seem to be a bit more fragmented and half-hearted on this. So I'm just curious whether that is a subjective impression or whether that's something that you recognize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Jan, if you're not too overwhelmed, I have also a few comments and questions. The first one, I haven't read the paper. I'm sorry, I should have, but I haven't had the time, unfortunately. But I would say, as Jonathan and Alvaro said, based on your presentation, I think you could do a lot more about how to frame your paper and in which literature you want to contribute the most. And perhaps look at either deliberative or the politicization or something else, but what is this conference? What's the meaning of it, either for comparative politics or more EU studies? Then I also had a question a bit similar to Ben on, for me, it wasn't clear what was the salience of the issue, because you put like the N for each, but compared to what and what kind of arguments are they making? And is this, for instance, much more salient for ECR than for IDEA? And do they have different strategies in their way, in the way they delegitimize it? Do they, like, from my understanding, but I would love to know more. Indeed, I had the same reading as Ben, as ECR had a more coherent view, whereas IDEA it was more like less cohesive and coherent, at least in the argument. And then I was wondering how did you choose the coding? Because, I mean, intuitively, it would not be like my first pick to take the metaphorical or theatrical aspect of it. How did you choose? And also, like, for me, the idea of the tyranny of the majority or the lack of public attention or the top-down, how does it fit the coding of theater? I'm not following you there. And so how did you choose that coding as a way to unpack their delegitimization strategy? And for me, it would have made perhaps more sense, but perhaps it doesn't fit your data, to look at either like populism indicator, Euroscepticism indicator, and nationalism indicator, for instance, and or to unpack like policy contestation, and politics contestation, like to play on those levels. So I was wondering, how did you choose those elements, and whether you have in your coding system variables to take into account the interinstitutional dynamic, so the government opposition dynamic that's happening at the national level, and how it can reflect something that's happening in the council. And also, like, are you planning to do interviews at some point to unpack the motivations of the actors? Because, for instance, I organized a conference at the university on the Parliament's report to reform the EU. And there was a lot of clashes that were really personal clashes between actors, especially between more mainstream groups and ECR representative. And my final comment was also to unpack a little bit more on the content of the positions they have. Is there a congruence, or do they match with, for instance, citizens' proposal? Do they clash on that? Because I could imagine, for instance, if you are strongly populist, you would not easily clash with something that comes up from popular decision. Or, for instance, the position of, I don't know, the Polish National Parliament versus what ECR is saying and PiS is saying in the European Parliament? Is there a match there? Is there like, or they don't? I know here it was on the European Parliament, but since it's a broader project, I would be interested. Thank you.
I wrote down some notes.
Yeah, it's a lot. So
sorry if I forget to answer for some question. Maybe I will start with Jonathan. If I understood well, you basically argued that the many publics in countries, in national states, in member states, weren't such politicized, similarly as CoFoE was, and why it should be different at the EU level, right? Did I understood well? My answer.
And what I was saying was, I mean, you seem to be advocating a kind of politicization, which doesn't seem to match with the cases in different countries, whether within the EU or outside, which are generally deemed to have been effective or impactful. Not that they didn't embody, politicized views, but they were clearly not party political in character. And the fact they were not party political is what gave them credibility and may also have enabled them to debate and come up with innovative solutions that could command a consensus. So I just wondered how the implicit argument that the process should have been more agonistic, and the claims of the let's say extreme right groups that they should also have been more representative of party political groups, why we would have expected that to have been beneficial by some criteria of impact and effectiveness.
Maybe I will more relate to the recent book what Alvaro just have published, and what Alvaro argues is that these debates at the EU level reproduced what European Commission has already had in his packet before, and it just served as legitimization. The Conference on the Future of Europe just served as legitimization of pre-prepared policies published by European Commission, and in the end, it didn't serve for new recommendations, for new innovations, for new policy recommendations, because the European citizens involved in the conference were limited to topics which they should discuss, and they didn't know. So that's one point of my, let's say, argument. The second point is that I think deliberative democracy at the EU level should be composed on the different features than many publics in the national states, because of, let's say, homogeneous of population in national states, less populations. There were citizens from 27 member states discussing from totally different positions and from totally different backgrounds from each national state. So I think that at the EU level, some kind of linkage between deliberative and representative democracy is necessary. That may be the normative point which I should put at the end of the article instead of consensus democracy. So that would be my my response which I got. But very good point, Jonathan. Then I have a note key aspect of AFCO. I think that was a topic which Ben Krum mentioned. And yes, indeed, AFCO had a big role on defining EP position. And with Karolina Boronská-Hryniewska, we are focusing on we are analyzing the AFCO committee meetings and interparliamentary meetings in AFCO, and you can see that they are very let's say there is no space for criticism. It's led by Renew Europe, by Guy Verhofstadt. If some politicians from national parliaments say some argument, they are smashed. And I think there is this discrepancy. And it's not served as really as interparliamentary cooperation. It's just European Parliament use it as a tool to proceed to get more power for itself. And it doesn't seem that that European Parliament help national parliaments in this AFCO meetings or in interparliamentary meetings. So that I would say based on that that it was the reason why ECR and ID were excluded or self-excluded, because there was no room for criticism from their point of views. And I think, yeah, maybe I should include this aspect into the paper. Then I have note about positions of ECR and ID. Yeah, that was also surprising that ID weren't such right-wing, extreme Eurosceptic towards the CoFoE, which I expected that they would be. And maybe it's maybe the reason is that they weren't so much MEPs who should be interested in the conference. There was 2 motions for resolutions. There was Gunnar Beck, who was very silent, but not more. Not many MEPs were from IE were interested in this topic. So maybe I am limited in that regard. On the other hand, ECR was quite interested. They developed their criticism quite clearly, deeply, and they also had their own conferences along national capitals during the conference. So they delegitimize Conference of the Future Europe on the one hand, but on the other hand, they did their own tour along Europe because they miss this intergovernmental potential and this intergovernmental positions at the Conference of the Future Europe. And the development of the left and ID during the conference, I think in the beginning all 3 groups were critical, but not very enthusiastic, let's say. And also MEPs from the left were critical because they lamented that they weren't invited to the executive board, for example, that in the executive board was only MEPs from Social Democrats, EPP, and from Renew. So like data, like the speeches can't say whether their position was just instrumentalization. I don't know. I can't say from this, and maybe I will now focus to Natalie question about the method, because what I basically did, it was inductive analysis, inductive thematic analysis, and inductive quantitative content analysis. And in the paper, which I only shared with Alvaro, I try to somehow explain and interpret why these codes or topics which I use are related to theoretical performance, and why the other are related to theoretical to the other theme which I framed as lack of representativeness. I also argue that these topics are very interlinked. It's not solely only one theme which is not which doesn't communicate with the other. And I would say that I quite use some narrative frame to explain to interpret why these codes are within this team and not in the other. But to be clear, these codes are very interlinked with each other, and I show it in the article. Yeah, but then I have a note about interviews. What will be the next stage of this research? Yes, so together with Carolina, we would like to do interviews. We would like to see what's the positions of MEPs and position of national and representative national parliaments towards participatory democracy, and whether they would be inclined to sort of be involved in this linkage between representative and participatory democracy, and how this linkage should look like in the future. What would be challenge, I would say, is to get interviews with these Eurosceptic MEPs. Let's see, but Natalie, you did it in your work, so hopefully we will be also lucky. And because that would be research in which we can say whether their position towards the Conference of the Future of Europe was instrumentalized, or it's their own position and which developed according to the CoFoE composition. Yeah, and that's work which we plan to do. We plan to visit COSAC meeting, which will be in 1 month in Brussels. So let's hope that we will gather some data there. And I'm sorry, but I don't know whether I respond to all questions, but nothing left on my paper.
I don't know if someone else has a question or a comment. I don't see any. So I think we can thank Jan and Alvaro, as well as everyone who participated and attended the seminar.